The oldest species in the galaxy has one rule: never make humans choose violence. Arbitrator Solen had been reviewing the Varan Legislative Archive for 3 weeks, which was, by her own admission, an unusual activity for the most senior diplomatic officer in galactic governance. The archive review was not her assignment. She had, in fact, no assignment that specifically required her to spend 3 weeks reading 11 million years of Varan law. She was doing it because she had a feeling, and she had learned, over 400 years of diplomacy, that her feelings about things deserved attention. The feeling had started when Vea's 3-page report had crossed her desk. The conclusion that the Varan had been studying humanity and had found themselves being changed by the act of study. The scholars submitting transfer requests to go live with humans for a year. Something had struck her as odd about the framing, not the conclusion. The conclusion was consistent with everything she'd observed over the past decade. What struck her was the language in the final section. We believe this is how it starts. She had read that line 12 times over 3 days before she understood what was bothering her. The Varan were 11 million years old. They had seen empires rise and fall. They had accumulated wisdom that made every other species in the galaxy look like children. They had not, in 11 million years, expressed uncertainty about a subject in the specific way that phrase conveyed. We believe this is how it starts. Not we have observed. Not our analysis indicates. We believe. The way you use believe when you're not certain, but the stakes are high enough to state it anyway. The Varan were not a species that expressed unverified beliefs. She had started reading their legislative archive on a Wednesday. She found the law on a Friday, 3 weeks later, in a subsection of the collective protocols that addressed interaction standards with newly contacted species. The law was classified, restricted access, accessible only to Varan elders, and, by virtue of her diplomatic role, to arbitrators of the Council. She had not known such a classification existed in Varan law. In 11 million years of governance, the Varan had classified very little. She read the law. Protocol Extension 7, 441, 392, T. Interaction Standards for Terran Sapient Species. Effective date: 11 years prior to current galactic standard date. Classification: restricted, Elder Council, and authorized diplomatic interfaces only. Asterisk: the following protocol additions apply specifically to interactions with members of Homo sapiens, human, or human-adjacent sapient species arising from the Sol System. Asterisk 1. Under no circumstances should diplomatic or military engagement be structured to require a member of this species to choose between violence and a principle they consider worth dying for. The outcome of such a choice is neither predictable nor recoverable. Asterisk. Asterisk 2. Interactions should be structured to offer alternatives wherever possible. Human decision-making in constrained option scenarios demonstrates higher variance than any comparable species in our dataset. Asterisk. Asterisk 3. Human capacity for sustained commitment to chosen objectives should not be modeled on standard persistence curves. Human persistence under opposition does not follow the standard decay model. When they decide something is worth pursuing, the expected persistence duration is indefinite. Asterisk. Asterisk 4. These protocols are additive, not exclusive, and do not supersede standard interaction guidelines. Asterisk. Rationale. See Elder Nan's testimony, attached. She sat very still for a long time. Then she requested an audience with Elder Nan. Elder Nan received her in a space that was not a room. Exactly. Varan architecture did not think in rooms the way most species did. It was an opening, a place with particular qualities of light and quiet that Varan culture treated as conducive to significant conversations. Nan was very old, even by Varan standards, which meant very old indeed. They moved with the slowness of something that had learned that speed was rarely the important variable. Solen asked when the protocol had been written. Non answered without hesitation. 11 years ago. Before the accession. Yes. Before the quarantine vote became public. Yes. Before any of it was officially acknowledged. We have been watching, Non said. We watch everything, over long enough time frames. 11 years ago, we have been watching humanity for approximately 60 years, which is, by our assessment timeline, very brief. We had, however, seen enough. Enough to make a law. Enough to make a specific law. We make many laws. This one is specific in a way that our laws usually are not. Non paused. The specific pause of someone accustomed to geological timescales, making an effort to communicate something precisely. Most of our interaction protocols are modeled on observed patterns. Here is a species. Here are their characteristic behaviors. Here is how to engage productively. Patterns observed over time, reduced to protocols. But not this one. Not this one, Non agreed. This one is not based on a pattern we have fully mapped. It is based on a quality we identified and did not have sufficient data to fully characterize. A quality that our 11 million years of pattern recognition told us was significant in the technical sense, worth noting explicitly before we understood it completely, because the failure mode of not noting it was severe. What quality? Solen said. Elder Non's testimony. Non was silent for a long moment. Not the silence of uncertainty. The silence of someone selecting the right words from a very... We have seen species that fight when threatened, Non said. We have seen species that submit. We have seen species that hide, that flee, that negotiate, that sacrifice. We understand all of these responses. They follow from identifiable imperatives. Self-preservation, group protection, resource optimization, all predictable, given enough information about the species. But humans don't fit any of these models. Humans fit all of these models. Partially, in different moments, under different conditions. Non-paused. The anomaly is not their responses. The anomaly is their decision-making process. When a human faces a constrained choice, a genuine dilemma, with significant stakes, they do something we have not observed in any other species in our dataset with comparable frequency and consistency. What? They make a values assessment, Non said. Not a survival calculation, not a resource optimization, a values assessment. They ask, what do I believe is right? And then they act on the answer to that question, even when, especially when, the survival calculation would suggest otherwise. Solen waited. This sounds familiar, she said carefully. Many species have ethics, principles. Many species have principles they will uphold when the cost is low, Non said. When the cost becomes too high, the survival imperative overrides the principle. This is standard. This is predictable. We can model exactly where the threshold is for any given species under any given pressure. They turn from the viewport. With humans, we cannot find a threshold. It is either much higher than any comparable species, or it does not function the same way. When they commit to a principle, when they have decided that something is worth a cost, the commitment does not decay at the standard rate under pressure. It sometimes appears to increase. The room was very quiet. Under existential pressure, Non continued. A species that has decided something is worth dying for is difficult. Not because they are aggressive, not because they are powerful, though they are, because they have already run the survival calculation and set it aside. There is no longer a price point at which you can stop them by raising the cost. They have decided the cost is acceptable. The only remaining question is outcomes. Solen thought about Yara Solis. Weapons cold against 214 warships. We're patient. This doesn't have to be anything other than a conversation. She thought about the endurance. 17 hours building an intelligence package under siege. She thought about the engineering team that had built 8 orbital platforms in 72 hours because they had already decided. The law, she said. Never make them choose between violence and a principle. If they are choosing, Nan said, they have already made the choice. The violence is already decided. What remains is only the timing. A pause. The protocol is not about preventing violence. It is about not creating the conditions in which violence has already been decided before it begins. What Yara was deciding. In the present, Yara Solis was in the relentless small galley, drinking bad coffee and reading a diplomatic summary that had been forwarded to her through 3 channels, each less official than the last. She had not been directly involved in the accession negotiations. She was, as she regularly pointed out, a ship commander, not a diplomat. She had not been at the table when Tobias Vance found the 300-year-old constitutional violation. She had not been in the room when Dara submitted her transfer request. She had been here, doing what she always did, reading, thinking, watching. Ezra appeared at the galley entrance. Dispatch from Sol Fleet Command. New directive from the Charter Review Committee. He looked slightly uncertain about the packet of documents. Apparently, there's a lot of it. There's always a lot of it, Yara said. She took the packet and began reading. Ezra watched her for a while, which he did sometimes when he was trying to understand what she was thinking. You look like you're not worried, he said. I'm not. We just acceded to a galactic government. There's an 11-million-year-old species that wrote a special law about us. The Veth fleet is repositioning, and no one's quite sure where. He paused. Most people would have concerns. Yara looked up. Every one of those things means we're moving forward, she said. The Varan made a law because they were paying attention. The Veth repositioned because the math changed. The accession happened because we showed up and did the work. She looked at him. What exactly am I supposed to be worried about? Ezra was quiet for a moment. Nan's testimony, he said. The law. The thing about, once we've decided something, we don't stop. Yara was quiet. It's not a threat, she said finally. It's a description. We're curious. We're patient. We don't stop when we think we're right about something. Those aren't threatening qualities. She looked at the stars through the small galley porthole. They're just what we are. She went back to reading. Ezra stood in the doorway for another moment, then went back to his station. He thought, she's right. He also thought, Nan is right. He also thought that both of these things being true was exactly what the law was about. The principle. Solen met with Nan twice more after the initial session. The third meeting, she brought a question she had been working up to. The law says, the outcome is neither predictable nor recoverable. She paused. Recoverable from what? What are you predicting might not recover? Nan was very still for a moment. When a species that has decided something is worth a cost encounters another species that underestimates that decision, that treats the commitment as a negotiating position, as something that can be reduced by raising pressure, they paused. The engagement that follows is not a negotiation. It has already moved past negotiation. The species that underestimated the commitment finds this out during the engagement, not before. And then the outcome is what it is, which may be recoverable in practical terms, ceasefires, treaties, rebuilding. But something changes. The relationship changes. The calculus of future interactions changes. Nan looked at her steadily. We have seen this with other species. We have seen what happens when a civilization that has decided something encounters another that treats that decision as rhetoric. You've seen it not go well. We have seen it not go well in ways that took centuries to resolve, Nan said. If they resolve. Solen thought about this for a long time. The quarantine, she said finally. 61 years of managing them instead of engaging them. If instead of the quarantine. The quarantine was not a violation of the protocol, Nan said. The quarantine did not require them to choose. It simply delayed contact, which was its own kind of mistake, but a recoverable one. They paused. We have been, very quietly, glad that no one on the council made a choice that was not recoverable. We watched carefully for it. We were concerned at several points. Solin thought about the Battle of Sol, about the Veth fleet's ultimatum, about every moment in 61 years when something could have gone differently. What would have happened, she said, if someone had made the wrong call? Nan was quiet for a moment that was long even by Varan standards. We don't know, they said. That is what the law is for, to ensure we never find out. Solin went back to Chamber Zero and read the law one more time. The outcome is neither predictable nor recoverable. She wrote in her private log. Asterisk 11 million years of galactic history, and the oldest species we know made a specific law about us. Not about our weapons, not about our military capability, about our decision-making, about what happens when we decide something is worth a cost. Asterisk. I used to think the quarantine was about containing a dangerous species. Asterisk. I am beginning to think it was about protecting a dangerous idea. The idea that you can stop something once it is already decided. Asterisk. Asterisk you can't. The Varan have known this for 11 years. Asterisk. I'm glad we found out the easy way.